What is the simplest possible piece of information? And can the simplest possible piece of information be used to send a complicated message? Because 150 years ago, Samuel Morse had to answer the same question. How do I send a message, a complicated message, with the simplest possible pieces of information? A presence, and a place and time, and maybe a bit of context. This piece of trail tape is present, but all that it really is a pink ribbon tied to a branch at this point in time and in this place. But here, based on the context of a forest and prior knowledge that I have, I know that this leads to a user-generated trail to the top. So there's a lot of message contained in just that presence. But without that context and prior knowledge, that doesn't mean anything. So, what if I don't have the opportunity for context? What if I want to send a more complicated message? Well, that's going to require words, isn't it? How am I going to send words with nothing but a presence and a non-presence and time? A dot and a dash and the space between, or a dit and a da, whatever you prefer. But that's all you need to send the entire alphabet. A, B, C, and so forth. And you can even ask a question. By now you've already figured out that I'm talking about Morse code. Dots and dashes. It wasn't obvious to Samuel Morse or Alfred Vail, his partner, how this was going to work. They originally intended for Morse code to be a visual language. The dots and dashes were supposed to be written on a piece of paper. They actually had a machine for entering the text that turned it into dots and dashes, and then a machine with a paper spool for receiving the dots and dashes. It wasn't until his telegraph operators had gotten used to sending and receiving a lot of messages that they all learned that they were starting to just recognize the first letters and then entire words just by the sound of them. Yeah, well, so what? No, really, so what? It's like a legitimate question. Everybody knows you can receive voice over the radio waves. We all know that our cell phone is a radio device of some sort. You can get moving images through radio waves. So why something as slow as Morse code? Well, I guess I can answer that question with another question, which is, why do people go sailing? Why do people ride horses? You don't need to do either of those things. There is no scenario in any future where we start sailing again. There's just no scenario in any future where we really start using horses again. So why do we keep riding horses? Why do people keep sailing? Well, I don't sail. I don't ride horses. But if you told me that tomorrow riding horses would be banned, or nobody would be riding a horse again, nobody would ever go sailing again, and we'd forget all the skills of horsemanship and sailing, I'd be sad about it. And you know, I think you'd be sad too. There's just some sort of deep part of our psyche that kind of just wants to keep things alive.
that doesn't want things to die. And when it comes to communicating on the radio, Morse code was the first. And that just makes it feel like it's worth something. Like there's just some reason to know it, to keep it alive, to be able to communicate. And so I think it's just purely for the romance of it. I could fly a plane around the world. I could ride in a diesel-powered cargo ship around the world, but you can't sail around the world and fly around the world at the same time. And you can't have the experience of sailing around the world. You can't have the experience of sailing somewhere without sailing somewhere. And it's the same with Morse code. You can't have the experience of trading messages with somebody else in this very strange, very esoteric, but very fascinating language without doing it. You can watch it happen, you can be jealous, you can like comprehend what's happening, you can think about it theoretically, but you have to do the thing to do the thing. I once read a passage in Moby Dick that was all about what it was like to be on a sailing ship, what it was like to be in the crow's nest of a sailing ship, up there, like how 75 feet, or up there 7,500 feet over the ocean in that crow's nest, sailing over the ocean. And we'll never have that experience again. We can only read about it. And I'm jealous of those people for that experience. But you know what? With Morse code, I don't have to be jealous of something that people knew how to do in the past, and something else that offered a certain kind of thrill. And that thrill was long distance communication with no other medium between the two people but thin air.
Every time I set my antenna up in a park and start working contacts from a park bench, inevitably somebody will walk up to me and they'll talk to me about how they think it's great I'm keeping this art form alive because, you know, we're gonna need it in the apocalypse, or we're gonna need it when all our social systems break down for whatever reason. And you know, I humor that because I don't want to continue the conversation. But no, it's not going to be useful in an emergency. There's no scenario in which a first responder is going to come running to your aid because of Morse code. You know, the Coast Guard doesn't use it anymore. They stopped monitoring the most Morse code frequencies in, I think, like 1997. The military doesn't force their signal people to know it. I think the only place they still use it is on those flashing lights between ships, which is, you know, useful there. But no, it's not going to help you with emergency communications. So again, why? It's associated with something that gave humans the ability to communicate with each other across distance and time. And it was the first time that we could do that wirelessly, the first time that we could do that without anything that we could see between us and the other person was with Morse code. And so because of that, it gets a reputation as being something useful in some way. And it also retains that sense of romance. And if you assumed that somebody somewhere is using Morse code, still keeping it alive, well, yeah, you'd be right. I'm one of those people. There's actually a fairly large number of us, and almost all of us are doing it over the amateur radio bands, over shortwave radio. But have you ever thought about why? Why are we keeping it alive? What are we using it for? Well, let me talk about why I got into it, about what lured me into learning the code. Arthur C. Clarke once said that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I think that electronics is magic, radio is magic. And imagine growing up as a kid, watching that magic made through a haze of solder smoke in your dad's workroom. But I was a kid in the days when long distance phone calls cost money and you couldn't just contact somebody from around the world on the internet or on your cell phone. So the only way to talk to somebody instantaneously around the world was with shortwave radio, it was with the amateur radio bands. But you have to have an amateur radio license to get access to those frequencies, to be allowed on those frequencies. And when I was a kid, that required you to show proficiency in Morse code. You had to do it on a test. People older than me even had to go to an FCC office to take that Morse code test, and it was taken seriously. But I was a smart kid, or I thought I was a smart kid. And that meant that as a smart kid, things were supposed to be easy for me. But Morse code doesn't care how smart you are or
how smart you think you are. Like learning any language, it takes work, it takes effort, it takes time. So my solution was just not to even try. Yeah, I'd like to think that I had some inspiring story about how I didn't let that defeat me, that some younger version of me had enough, just pure grit to stick it through and learn the code so that I could get on the air. But that wasn't me, I didn't do that. So I waited until 2002 to take a test and get my technician license. Because by 2002, you no longer needed to learn Morse code to get the first class of license. But the problem with that class of license is that it only gives you access to frequencies that don't travel around the world. It only gives you access to frequencies that travel maybe as far as your city or the next city. So it really I didn't do anything with it. There wasn't anything to do with it. Like I could talk to people around town and then kind of figure out who was on the radio at that point and then just get bored with it. So I stopped using it. I just didn't touch it until 20 years later. I renewed it after 10 years because you have to renew it every 10 years. And then another 10 years passed. It had been 20 years since I got the license. And I renewed it again. And in the process of renewing it, I looked up on Google. I just decided to Google what's fun about amateur radio. What do people do with it? Somehow in all my searching, I came across Parks on the Air first. Parks on the Air is this activity where you go to different parks that are designated and you set up your portable radio and then you start making contacts. But people do that with the voice modes and they do that with the Morse code. Well, by 2022, they had dropped the Morse code requirement. They actually dropped it in 2007. I wasn't paying attention, I wish I had been. So I took the test and I upgraded my license to general. And I started activating summits and parks using the voice modes, which we call phone. But you know, voice only gets you so far. And I think in the end, I'm sort of an elitist at heart. But also, I'll be honest, the thing that really got me into Morse code was this, the KX2. It's a radio by Elecraft, and what I loved about it is that it's just so small. And I saw my friends out there activating in Morse code, making contacts everywhere, because Morse code travels better than voice modes do. And let's talk a little bit more about that. We call it propagation. Propagation refers to how far and widely a signal will travel. How far away can people hear you? And the simpler the signal, the less it's there, the less bandwidth, as we say, the better it propagates. So in Morse code, a 5-watt signal will propagate about as well as 100 watts of voice, which means I can use a tiny little radio and get just as far. That's pretty attractive. But you know what? It was summits on the air. That's what finally kicked me in the rear and got me to want to learn Morse code. It was again because of those tiny radios that I was talking about. I had to get into it. And let me tell you something about amateur radio operators. We are a curmudgeonly bunch. We're always worried that our hobby is on the cusp of disappearing. That if we don't get more young people involved, if we don't get more people interested in the hobby, it's gonna be gone forever. And ironically, it was the Morse code requirement being there, the fact that you had to show Morse code proficiency in order to do the good stuff, that kept people like me out. It turns out that dropping the Morse code requirement is exactly what got me to learn Morse code. Because single sideband, the voice mode, the mode that gets you on the air, the easiest, is just a gateway drug. It's just not as good. It's not as fun, it's not as engaging, and it doesn't travel as well. It doesn't give you as many options as Morse code does. And so the irony of all of this is that the real reason I learned Morse code was because I wasn't forced to, because I was allowed on the air and I was allowed to find out how limited the non-Morse code bands really are. And as an English major, as a technical person who is just as fascinated with the humanities side of things as I am bewitched by the technology, there's nothing more interesting than Morse code. I just am so fascinated with the layers of abstraction that are represented in Morse code. But of all the transformational technologies throughout history, I think it's fair to say, and there are plenty of scholars who agree with me, that as a matter of fact, it's the alphabet that's the most transformational piece of technology. It's the one that had the biggest effect on creating the modern world as we know it today. Because in addition to the mathematics that came from the necessities of operating commerce, the alphabet is what allowed us to divorce ideas, to separate abstract ideas from the specific objects that they are represented by. So rather than needing to draw a picture of a rock in order to bring the idea of a rock into somebody's head, you could just spell it out using the sounds of speech. Taking the sounds of speech and encoding them into letters was a huge leap, a huge transformation. The part that's relevant to Morse code is that encoding of the sounds of speech to symbols. Because then Morse code takes those symbols that encode speech and turns them back into sounds. Now you can use other presences as non-presences, you can use light, you can use anything, but in the context of radio, it uses sound. So it takes the wide bandwidth sound, it takes the wide bandwidth signal of human speech, that's a lot of bandwidth, and then it transfers it to the alphabet, and then it takes that alphabet and then creates a very narrow bandwidth version of transmitting that speech. So it takes longer than regular human speech, but it can propagate better. Experienced Morse code operators can copy, or rather they can interpret Morse code completely in their head. Very experienced operators are known and have been known to have entire conversations with each other just in Morse code. They actually hear the sounds of Morse code as whole words, and then when they get really good, they start to hear those sounds of Morse code as entire sentences. And so when they're getting to the point that they're sending it 30 to 40 words per minute, they're having just natural conversation in Morse code, and that's possible. Now, most of us can't do that, including me. It takes a lot of years of practice and kind of a special person to get to that point. But it's miraculous how we can go from the sounds of speech to an alphabet to an auditory encoding of the alphabet. It's just magical abstraction. This is the kind of stuff that I just love, and it's wonderful to have the opportunity to play around with it. And maybe I'll just leave it at that. Just leave it at the romance of the whole thing. There is some practicality to it. When I'm making an overseas contact with somebody for whom English is their second language, they don't have an accent in Morse code, and that person may only know the Morse code exchange in order to complete that DX contact. And that's it. But I don't have to listen through their accent, and so I understand them better and I understand them faster. There's just something about being able to hear that tone coming through the ether that's not feathering in and out of the noise like someone's voice does. Your mind just grabs onto it. And to just know that the only computer you need is the one that's between your ears. The only filter you need is the one that's in your brain that you trained yourself and somebody else on the other side trained themselves to be able to do. And it's just human mind to human mind communicating in a medium that would have never been thought possible, like ever, until like a little over 100 years ago, and now seems weirdly anachronistic, and yet for the 8,000 years of written human history is so recent. It's this beautiful thing. And that's just almost as elementally simple as radio could possibly get. And I think that's why I love it.